All right. Okay. I had a conversation the other day with a guy in America who's articulated to me something about the elemental archetype system developed by Tammo de Jongh. Most people, if they've heard of this at all, have probably seen this book, which is called The Wheel of Life. And basically, this book is an exposition of the ideas generated by Tammo de Jongh, although this book is by a guy called Richard Gardner. Um, and he was explaining to me how he was in a lecture and a workshop talking about handshapes and using the elemental system for classifying handshapes. And suddenly, instead of just there being four elemental handshapes, there was earth, water, fire, and air. Suddenly there were 12. And the 12 are the elemental archetypes that are described by this system developed by Tammo de Jongh. And that's a pictorial representation of them on the front cover of this book. I'll explain a bit more about that shortly, but the confusion when you're talking about handshake types, an earth hand is a square palm with short fingers, an air hand is a square palm with long fingers, a fire hand is an oblong palm with short fingers, and a water hand is an oblong palm with long fingers. And you can see an example of those handprints on the top of my master handreader page on YouTube channel. That banner at the top is actually an example of each four handshake types. So that's a very simple classification that was developed by Fred Gettings in 1965 in his book, The Book of the Hand. He's the pioneer and the originator of the four-element handshake classification system. And it's to him we owe a huge great debt of creating a way of classifying handshapes that's both simple and effective. The two primary features of the hand are the shape of the palm and the fingers, and whether those fingers are long or short in relationship to the palm tells you a lot about the mentality of the person. Whether the palm is thin or broad tells you a lot about the physicality of the person. So you get these four combinations. The fingers represent the mind, the palm represents the body. So you've got a different proportion of mind-body balance between those four. So earth and fire handshapes have more body because the fingers are short in relation to the palm. Water and air handshapes are more mentally or internally orientated because their fingers are longer, in proportion to the palm. So it becomes quite clear it's a very clear and simple system for classifying handshakes. And it's what I use, and that's what I recommend everybody uses. And it works very effectively. However, if you try and introduce an idea that comes from a completely different source into that mix, you're going to get confused. And this is what this guy talks to me about when the workshop they were doing, they suddenly started talking about earth air hands and fire water hands, where you've got therefore a square palm with both short fingers and long fingers at the same time, or an oblong palm with short fingers and long fingers at the same time. And there was a confusion there between using the elements as a nomenclature for classifying handshake types and the use of the archetypes. And the archetypes in this particular case came from the work of Tammo de Jongh. So who the hell's Tammo de Jongh? Well, Tammo de Jongh was as a Dutch guy, was an artist. He was living in North London. He was actually he founded the first ecological society, political party, or Green Party in about 1965. He was an artist and basically living in a squat in Kentish Town in North London. And was very interested in spiritual ideas, interested in Jung, and interested in Gurdjieff. And interested in environmental issues. And so he founded a society called the Graigian Society. Graig is a Welsh word meaning rock. Here's a pamphlet from the Graigian Society. From there, a Graig, which is in Welsh actually, and English, but he founded this society to preserve the spiritual life and the values of, I'll just read some of the qualities of it, the spiritual life and environmental values. So he says, the kind of principles are to bring about a caring and sensitive society, to make general public aware of spiritual values, to draw attention to lovely places which are threatened, to organize voluntary help to clear away dumps, pick up litter, restore ancient buildings and plant trees, to promote the ideals of the society, quality instead of quantity, to nurture understanding between human beings and their relationship to each other, animals and plants, to initiate the new age in which organic lifestyles with meaningful expression in arts and crafts become the norm. So he founded this society in this part of North London, and they also had a property in Wales, which they used to go to. That's why the Welsh connection, and so there's a kind of relationship between the urban areas of London and the very rural, remote areas of North Wales that they used to go to. And he described himself as a place in London as a New Age monastery. So he was like the first person to create a kind of a monastic tradition based around these ideas that he generated. And the ideas that he generated was basically trying to find a way to relate human experience within the natural world. So there's very strong emphasis upon nature, living in nature, being aware of nature, and being aware, therefore, of the four elements: earth, water, fire, and air. And he explains in this booklet, this is actually the manifesto of the Graigian Society. It's a booklet called Natural Psychology. This is the definitive exposition on the philosophy of Tammo de Jongh. And he basically explains in there how he was working with the elements and came across the notion of the four functions in Jungian psychology of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And noticed that Jung kind of made these up and then invented these terms, extrovert and introvert, and came up with 8 archetypes. And he thought that wasn't really very good because it wasn't based upon natural principles. So he'd started to take these ideas and evolve them, and clearly seeing the connection between the elements and the humoral tradition of Western esoteric traditions, and the ideas that Jung had developed, and kind of like seeing how they could be used as a sort of form of psychology, but instead of being a theoretical psychology, being a natural psychology. And what he observed with that was that the elements don't exist in isolation. They exist in relationship to one another. So the whole booklet is all about the relationship between the elements: earth and water, earth and air, earth and fire, water and earth, water and fire, water and air, and so on and so on. So if you do that kind of combination of those elements, then what you end up is with 12 elements, 12 archetypes of each of those combinations of elements, each of the elements in combination with each of the other elements. So, and from that, he, as an artist, then painted these pictures, which were to describe the kind of characterize a pictorial representation of these different archetypes. So in another book, which is by Richard Gardner, you can see these archetypes being painted out here. So for example, you've got the Joker, the clown on the top left, on the top right there, and the old woman, the actress, the scientist, the child, and the warrior. So that's 6 of the archetypes, and these were paintings that he painted. There's the observer, and the actress, the warrior, and the child. And these are paintings that he developed he painted to develop the idea of the archetype, to make it visually representative and to be demonstrated and easily to see and understand by other people. And if anybody, if you know your rock music, there's a band called King Crimson, which came around about that time, and they actually used these images on one of their album covers. Here's the other 6 of the archetypes. So you've got the logician, the enchantress, the Joker, Mother Nature, going the wrong way, and over there you've got the patriarch and the slave. So these are all different elemental combinations, and he understood that elements don't exist by themselves, but they exist in combinations. So for example, water and air together make mist, water and earth together make mud, fire and air together work together to make flames, fire and earth together make volcanoes. So he took this natural analog to understand how these elements work within us, and to kind of create this kind of way of talking about human experience, and develop this entirely complicated system of natural psychology, which if you want to read the books, they're probably not available, but you know, you could look them up maybe. I mean, the most common one people use is is this one here, The Wheel of Life by Richard Gardner. Never actually worked out what the relationship is between Richard Gardner and Tammo de Jongh. But Richard Gardner didn't invent this system. It was invented by Tammo de Jongh. He just presents it, and he's got two books. There's an earlier book. I think this book came out about 1990. Just recheck that one. Yeah, 1980. The Wheel of Life came out in 1980, but Purpose of Love is his earlier version, but came out in 1970. So this is also an exposition of the teachings of Tammo de Jongh. And given that this was published around the same time as Tammo de Jongh was running the Graigian Society in North London, so that was from the late 60s to the middle 70s, that sort of time. That was when Tammo de Jongh's ideas were being taught and were very prominent. And Richard Gardner, I assume, therefore, knew him and had permission for him to write this book, because those pictures, those paintings that I showed you, which were painted by Tammo de Jongh, are in this book. So they were clearly friends. So what's this got to do with hand reading? Well, that's a really, really good question. And actually, it has absolutely nothing to do with hand reading whatsoever, except there was this fellow in London called Terry Jukes, and Terry Jukes decided to restart the Chirological Society in 1975. And Terry Jukes was very interested in the elements, and he was interested in Buddhism, and Buddhism talks about the elements earth, water, fire, and air, and he was very interested in occult literature, and he was interested in all that, and astrology and all those kind of things. So he was very aware of those kind of ideas. And when he decided to reform the Chirological Society, he developed this whole elemental approach to looking at the hands. And he presented it as being completely unique tradition from China or Japan, when actually it wasn't at all. Andrew Fitzherbert and I have corresponded many times over this particular issue, and Andrew Fitzherbert happened to be in London in 1976 and 77 and corresponded with Terry Jukes at that time. And I've seen the correspondence between them, and it's quite clear that Terry Jukes is making all this shit up at that time. But he claimed that what he was doing was he had a connection to the original Chirological Society of Catherine St Hill in Oxenford, and there's absolutely no connection between the society that he refounded in 1975 with Joe Bolitis and Doran Swade and a couple of other people like that. So again, we're in the early middle 70s, the time when the Graigian Society is flourishing, and Terry Jukes is really keen to find anything that's to do with elements. So he takes the elemental handshake classification from Fred Getting's book. He uses that and says, oh, but this is the Buddhist tradition of elemental classification. And it's true that there's a different understanding of the four elements in the Buddhist tradition. In fact, there's 5 elements in the Buddhist tradition. So you've got earth, water, fire, air, and akasha, or space, or consciousness. So there's a 5th element, which is represented by the thumb, not just the 4 elements that's found in the hermetic traditions of Europe or in the alchemical and traditions, and that was picked up by Jung. So Jung's very much drawing from the European and Western traditions of esoteric thought. In Buddhist traditions or in Vedic traditions, there are 5 elements. So there's the earth, water, fire, air, and space, or akasha. So Terry Jukes, being the magpie that he was, and someone who liked to steal things without accreditation, stole the idea of the elements on the handshakes from Fred Gettings. Fred Gettings, as I said, is the first person to write about that. And actually, if you look in Fred Gettings' book, and I can't remember exactly the page, maybe I should get it out for you now, but in that book, he talks about quadrants, and what he does is he draws the whole hand into 4 sections, and he talks about the inner and the outer, and the conscious and the subconscious, and he basically divides the hands into those four. Let me just draw a picture, if I can pick a picture up of that. He divides the hand into those 4 sections, and then talks about them as quadrants. So Fred Gettings, of course, was an art student and an art historian, and he was interested in occult stuff, and that's how he got interested in handwriting. But his system of 4-element handshake types comes from the esoteric traditions of Europe, and so he talks about the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air in the same way that Jung does. But what's interesting in this book also, he describes this division into the hand into the what's called four quadrants. And you can see that there, that basically what you've got is a division into the inactive and passive and inner and outer. And for any of you who know anything about the Ecological Society, who studied within that particular organization, you'll immediately recognize those terms as a description of the four quadrants as they became known within ecological analysis. Now, the four quadrants, active, passive, inner, and outer, in the way that Terry Jukes applied it, he applied it to just the palm, not to the whole hand. And what he developed from that was an entire system of analyzing the hand based upon this elemental system. And it's quite clear that he got this from Tammo de Jongh, because when you look at the book that explains natural psychology, or look at that, what you get there is you get a description of, I'm just getting that picture right for you. That's it, there you go. No, other way, there we go. You'll see he's talking about the quadrants. First quadrant, second quadrant, third quadrant, and fourth quadrant. And he talks about it entirely in terms of the elements. So he, in his natural psychology system, he goes from one element to 12 elements to looking at every possible combination of the elements, the four elements, and putting them in order. And that became the entire basis for Terry Jukes' system of hand reading. And there was even a book he wrote called Analyzing Personality Through the Palmar Quadrants, which is basically using the elements and applying the elements to the hand and describing personality from the elements alone. But where did he get those ideas from? Because, you know, he was a magpie. He just stole stuff. He just copied other people. And he looks like he got it completely from Tammo de Jongh. So he said the first element dominates the essential self. The second element is repressed or denied. The third element dominates the personality. The fourth element means fulfillment. And so this very notion of this presentation by Tammo de Jongh is exactly what fuels the understanding of the quadrant assessment that we used to do in the Ecological Society. So that's where Terry Jukes got this idea from. And in that context, actually Tammo de Jongh's ideas are incredibly useful, because what happens when you have something like a quadranture of the hand and you're looking for the balance of earth and water and fire and air and looking at the balance of those four elements, what you find is you have two elements that are dominant. So somebody might have air and fire. They're two dominant elements in first and third position. Or somebody may have earth and water dominant, but in earth first and water third. The two dominant elements, the first one and the third one, like it says in this book here, the first element dominates the self, the third element dominates the personality. Those are the two most significant elements, because they're the ones that actively engage with and actually expressing out in the world. Now, if you've got a 12-fold system of elements, which you've got in the archetypes, it makes complete sense to apply those, because you might have air and fire as the two dominant elements, in which case you're the logician. Or you may have earth and water first and third, in which case you're Mother Earth. In which case, the references within this book, the descriptions of the archetypes within this book, actually can be applied. So it's not something to be done to hand shapes, because hand shapes can't stand on their own. They're not a combination of elements. You can only use the wheel of life, the purpose of love, the principles of natural psychology in a situation when you're combining two different elements together, when you're looking at something and saying these are the two dominant elements. And so, funnily enough, The Purpose of Love was one of the recommended books in the Ecological Society for the entire time it was operational. It was the one book in a kind of strangely hidden in plain sight kind of way. Terry Jukes was telling everybody where he got his ideas from, and of course he claimed that they were original. But you could get this book from Richard Gardner. He was publishing them privately, so you had to order them from him directly, which is also quite esoteric, I guess. But we all got this book and we all studied this book, and it was relevant to what we were doing because it enabled us to see the elements in combination. So here's a little wheel of the elements that I did, like a wheel of life that I must have done in 1984 or 1985 or something like that, you know, where it talks about the warrior is the fire-earth element combination as opposed to the slave, which is the earth-fire combination. And so these archetypes play out when you're looking at the elements in the hand. The trouble is, it's a completely arbitrary and made up system, and it's completely doesn't work the way that Terry Jukes did to taught that system. The quadrant of the hand is notoriously difficult to do, and I persisted with that, and I developed so much time and effort to try and work out how to use it, and I gave up. I gave up because it's just not accurate, and there are many more things in the hand which are much more accurately describing people's personalities, and much more accurately describing what goes on in them without a superimposition of a paradigmatic frame of reference onto the hand in a kind of mathematical and arbitrary way by dividing the palm into 4 sections using a ruler, or measuring the number of square centimeters that each end of the hand take up to work out what the dominant element is. No. I mean, you could use the natural psychology principles where you're combining 2 other elements, for example, like the hand shape and the skin texture. That would work. Or if you wanted to combine, for example, the elemental rule of a fingerprint pattern with the finger that it's found, like having a whirl air, which is an air type of fingerprint pattern, on the index finger, which is the water finger, that might work too. But the reason why natural psychology was important was because it was, and the purpose of love was important, was because it worked in terms of the quadrant system that was devised by Terry Jukes and implemented during the Ecological Society, until we all gave it up and said, this is a load of rubbish, we won't do it anymore. But, Mr. Bruning, you can't apply it to hand shapes. It doesn't work on hand shapes. It's not about hand shapes. Read the book, read the study, read what Tammo de Jongh's talking about. It's a philosophy that he's developed in 1965 to 1970, combining his artistic interest with Jungian psychology and Gurdjieffian insights. And he's using that within the context of an imminent and nascent green environmentalist movement coming out of North London with concern for spiritual values and environmental concerns. Really, really early. The Ecology Party in Britain was founded in 1973. The Graigian Society was around before that. So it's wonderful and it's inspirational and it's completely bonkers and pretty mad as well. But if you are doing elemental hand reading, whether you're studying with Felicity or myself or even Jenny Hirsch, it's actually quite useful to get these books because he talks a lot about the elements and it'll get you thinking about the elements and get you working with the elements. And the elements are the absolute key thing to understanding the hands. But you have to understand what they are, you have to understand what they're for, and you have to understand how to use them. And it's quite obvious to me that a lot of people don't understand the elements and don't use them correctly and don't use the potency and the power that they have. The elements are not just a system of nomenclature. It's not just a naming system. The elements are a hermeneutic. They are the key to interpreting the hand. And if you want to understand that, you're going to have to study with somebody who knows what that means. So if you're interested in studying with me, give me a call, send me an email. If you like this video, like and subscribe. There's plenty more stuff where this is coming from. So now you know where Terry Jukes got his ideas of quadrants from. Now you know how to apply the elements in the hand. And if you're interested in elements, these books are really, really good, really, really useful. I'll put the references for them in the show notes. And there's one other book on elements that you might like to look at too. It's called The Four Elements by Margaret Gullen-Wurr. I remember her writing this book when she came up to Norfolk and kind of came and interviewed us in the Ecological Society about the Four Elements. Again, she's drawing it very much from the system of Jungian system of elements. This was 1987, this book was published. Yeah, there's not that many books written on hands. Sorry, not that many books written on the elements. So to develop your elemental language and the sophistication of the vocabulary of that, these books are useful for that purpose. All right, okay, that'll do for now.